My boyfriend and I were dating and were in a stable relationship, and the New Year's marked our 4-year anniversary. Usually we keep things low-key, but this time we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, both of us were living in Denver and yearned for a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. After some searching, we found a charming cabin in the woods on Airbnb complete with a hot tub, and we were immediately sold. The cabin was predictably the last house on the road, tucked away down a secluded private road. The cabin sat atop a garage, and to reach the front door, you had to ascend some stairs at the back of the property. Upon arriving, we were greeted by a gorgeous snowy scene. The cabin looked beautiful amidst the white surroundings. Inside, there was a helpful booklet providing information about the cabin. It mentioned that during the snowy season, the contracted snowplow service might show up to clear the driveway. We unpacked and realized that we had no cell phone or internet service. Thankfully, the booklet informed us that there was a landline available if we needed assistance. Our first night was spent cozily by the fire, playing board games and sipping wine. It was just what we needed. Our plans for the next day included exploring the town and enjoying a nice dinner. After a day filled with activities, we briefly returned to the cabin to freshen up before our dinner reservation. Dinner was fantastic, and we couldn't wait to return to the cabin for a champagne hot tub session. However, while we were at dinner, the temperature dropped and it began to snow for the first time that day, blanketing everything in a fresh layer of powder. As we approached the cabin's driveway after dinner, my boyfriend stopped the car, the headlights illuminating our path. He pointed out the new tire tracks on the driveway. I glanced at the driveway, hoping to dismiss the new tire tracks, but they were unmistakable. Suddenly, we remembered that the snowplowers could have been here. But it seemed strange. Why plow in the dark? Realizing that we had no cell phone service at the cabin, we decided to return to town to message our Airbnb hosts and ask if they or one of their friends had stopped by while we were out. In town, we waited for a reply from our hosts, but received none. We could have called, but it was getting late and we didn't want to be troublesome guests. We started thinking that we might have been overly paranoid, considering my penchant for true crime, spooky subreddits, and horror movies. My boyfriend drove us back to the cabin, this time proceeding up the driveway. Near the top of the hill portion of the driveway, I noticed something unsettling. My heart sank as I spotted footprints on the property. We reversed down the driveway, searching for more footprints. It appeared that someone had driven up the driveway, then reversed, parked, and exited the car, leaving footprints on the property. Since we had also driven on the same tracks, we couldn't determine where the footprints ended. The property was vast, with plenty of trees and underbrush, and those footprints could lead anywhere. As soon as we saw the footprints, we decided to call the police. We thought it was better to be safe than sorry. We drove down the road until we had cell phone service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. A police officer arrived, and we followed him onto the property. He carefully scanned the surroundings and concluded that there was no one present. We felt somewhat embarrassed and shaken, but thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to soak in the hot tub in the dark woods after what had transpired. Instead, we locked all the doors and watched a movie without the champagne. Both of us were tired from the day's events and eventually fell asleep. At 3 a.m., we both awoke on the couch with the TV still on and all the lights in the cabin illuminating our surroundings. We laughed about how the night had veered off course. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise, a mechanical sound that lasted just a few seconds. It was the garage door. Few circumstances could warrant someone opening the garage door of an Airbnb guest's accommodation at 3 in the morning. We had woken up with all the lights on, and the cabin had numerous windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they were aware of our presence and could see us. Panicking, I grabbed the landline and dialed 911. We crouched inside the Airbnb, praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever had made those tire tracks was still on the property, and this time, they were making noise. While talking to the operator, we heard a bang on our balcony as if something had been thrown up there. I was terrified when the operator informed me that the police were nearby. Suddenly, they were there. We saw the police lights, and they began searching the property. Soon, we heard banging on the door, and it was the police. We were safe. At the door stood 2 policemen, one in front of us and another behind, casually poking around in the snow and inspecting the ground. The officer in the back was the same one who had initially checked the property. The police officer informed us that not only was the garage door closed, but it was locked, and there were no signs of anyone on the property. We considered leaving, but the police officers cautioned us against it due to the dangerous road conditions at that hour. I couldn't help but feel that I had disappointed the police officer who had been to the property twice that night. My boyfriend and I returned inside, locked all the doors once again, and tried to get some sleep. The next day, we prepared to leave. While we had survived the night, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling in the cabin anymore. It had become the spooky cabin in my mind, and I couldn't wait to leave. As we packed, we heard the same noise we had heard at 3 a.m. It was just the heater, a heater that made a sound eerily similar to a garage door, lasting the same duration. My boyfriend gave me an amused look and said, "You need to give up your murder shows before walking away." As for the banging on the balcony, it turned out to be the well-timed fall of a pine cone. I often reflect on this story, feeling both embarrassed about how little came of it and incredibly grateful for the same reason. My mother rented a cabin for us, about 4 hours north of our home. My father couldn't attend due to work, which was fine with him. We drove up to the cabin, which was essentially a 15 by 15 room with an attached bathroom, just enough space for a bed, a table, and a small television. It appeared cute enough from the outside. There were several identical cabins available for rent, totaling 7 in all. At the front of this line of cabins was where the owner of the cabin stayed, the front desk area, if you will. When we first arrived, we were the only people there. No other cabins had been rented out, even though it was August, and this area, while somewhat remote, was a tourist destination. The gentleman who worked at the front desk and owned the cabins came out to greet us. I didn't pay too much attention as I was just 12 years old and excited about the outdoor adventures my mother and I were planning, climbing the dunes, eating ice cream, swimming, and having campfires, all the good stuff. I do remember him giving my mom the keys and saying, "The bathroom window is broken and does not close all the way nor lock." We found it strange since we were the only occupants. Why not give us a room with a bathroom window that locked? But we shrugged it off. After a day of adventure, we returned at dusk and went to bed. The next morning, a Saturday, we woke up and went to get in the truck, but it wouldn't start. It was strange because, at the time, it was a relatively new SUV. I don't recall what was wrong with it, but I do remember the owner of the cabins coming out and saying, "Ah, your truck is broken, that's too bad. Let me call someone." My mom insisted that she could call someone herself and went into his office to use his phone to arrange for repairs. As we waited for someone to arrive, the owner came out and asked, "Did you guys have any problems with the power last night?" Mom and I shook our heads, puzzled. "Oh, well, sometimes in that cabin, the power will randomly go out. All you have to do is come out here and flip the breaker." He then proceeded to show my mother where the breaker was, which happened to be outside the cabin, behind it, on a pole. After getting the truck fixed and having another day of adventure, we returned to the cabin, ready to settle in for the night. As we sat in bed watching television, the power went out, not a flicker, just boom, it was gone. Mom grabbed a flashlight she had packed, and we went outside to turn the breaker back on. At this point, we were feeling incredibly uneasy, as anyone would be. We got back in bed, and about 10 minutes later, the power went out again. Mom jumped up and ran outside, only to see a man, whom I assume was the owner because no one else was there, running away from the fuse box. We packed up and left as fast as we could. Fortunately, everything had been packed already since we were leaving the next day. I was 11 years old when this incident occurred. Susan, my older sister, was 14, and Jane, my younger sister, was 8. My dad worked as a freelance programmer during my younger years. While he earned good money from his jobs, he was burdened with substantial debt, over $300,000, and my mom wasn't particularly skilled at managing finances. Consequently, we rarely had extra money available for vacations. Our family vacations typically consisted of visits to relatives' homes. One day, my dad completed a lengthy project for a major client, and to celebrate, we decided to watch a new movie, Final Destination, as my dad enjoyed watching scary films and scaring my sisters and me. We were engrossed in the movie when the phone suddenly rang. My dad answered it and returned with my mom while we continued watching. My younger sister, Jane, used the opportunity to pause the film and hold Tommy, our dog, hostage due to her fear. About 10 minutes later, my parents returned and made an unexpected announcement. We were going to spend the weekend at a cabin. We were initially perplexed by this change in plans, but it turned out that the client my dad had assisted owned a cabin by a lake in the mountains and had offered us the opportunity to stay there for the weekend at a significantly reduced cost. It was a Thursday evening, so my mom hastily began packing in a frenzy to prepare for our trip. This meant that we didn't get to finish watching the movie that night. The next day, after school, we loaded up our family van and set off for the mountains. The drive took about 2.5 hours, so it was quite late by the time we arrived. We unloaded our belongings and began exploring the cabin. The cabin was a single-story ranch-style dwelling with a small nook that could be reached via a few steps, approximately head height. It was about 3 feet tall and likely intended for storage, but it became an ideal spot for the three of us to hang out and play games. There were dozens of board games in this nook, so we started playing once we had selected our rooms. My parents claimed the largest room, Susan chose the smaller room with a twin bed, so Jane and I ended up in the last room, which had a queen-sized bed we would share. Our room had a window on the right side of the bed, lacking a curtain, and a lamp on the left side. This lamp served as the room's sole light source, and there was a locked closet opposite the bed that we couldn't access. I never did discover its contents. We went to bed around 11. Jane had a habit of kicking in her sleep, so I opted to sleep closer to the lamp in case she knocked it over. I remember lying down and must have fallen asleep instantly because the next thing I knew, Jane was clutching my arm and trying to burrow beneath me. She was saying something in a frightened voice, but I couldn't comprehend her words. As I sat up and turned to look at her, I saw something pale and human-shaped moving away from the window. My drowsy mind took several moments to process this, but when it did, I sprang out of bed and pulled Jane with me. We rushed to our parents, who dismissed our concerns as products of our imagination. My mom instructed us to return to bed and inform them if we witnessed anything else. Regrettably, and much to my current chagrin, we agreed and went back to our room. We swapped places, with Jane refusing to sleep by the window. I shared a story to help her fall asleep and quickly did the same. Morning came, and I didn't wake up until then. The following day, we ventured around the lake for about an hour before my dad decided we would spend the day in town. The town boasted numerous small shops, and my parents visited each one. We had lunch and dinner in town before heading back to the cabin. As we approached the cabin, Susan made a joke and everyone laughed. However, as my dad reached for the door, he motioned for everyone to be silent. He gently pushed the unlocked door open with a single finger. I thought it strange that the door wasn't latched, but didn't immediately grasp the significance. "Dad?" Susan moved closer to Jane and me, but my dad gestured for her to remain quiet. He entered the cabin and disappeared inside for a minute or two while we waited on the porch. My mom called out his name, and he called back that we could come inside. We entered and found him in the living room, wearing a frown. He locked the door once we were inside, and then spoke to my mom privately in their bedroom. Susan, who had figured out what was happening, suggested we continue playing the board game we had enjoyed the previous night to keep Jane and me distracted. We played for a few hours until my dad informed us it was time for bed. It was only 9, which upset Susan, since she was allowed to stay up until 10:30 on school nights and even later on weekends. Jane and I returned to our room while Susan and my parents continued their discussion. We climbed back into our respective spots, with Jane by the window and me by the lamp. I read to her for a while before we drifted off to sleep. I awoke to my dad rushing into our room. He scooped up Jane and took my hand, pulling me out of bed. He rushed me into the hallway, where I saw Susan experiencing the same treatment from my mom. I became aware of a high-pitched whine coming from the living room, and our dog, Tommy, sat on a lurk near the back door, her fur bristling. My dad didn't put Jane down and never released my hand. He hurried us out of the house and into the van, then returned to retrieve Tommy. We left the cabin in a hurry, with my dad driving us all the way back home without uttering a word. It took Tommy about half an hour to calm down. My dad explained to Susan what had occurred the following day, but Jane and I didn't learn the full story until years later. That night, my dad had been awakened by moaning sounds outside his window. When he investigated, he discovered that the front door was unlocked. He also noticed that items in the kitchen had been moved, and Tommy began growling at the ajar back door. My dad secured the door and got us out of the house. He returned the next day to retrieve our belongings and discovered several sets of footprints outside Jane's and my window.